Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really intense chapter today, Acts 23.135. It's got accusations, political maneuvering, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it really does. And, I think what's especially interesting about this passage is that it really highlights how how adept he was at navigating both Jewish and Roman law.
Right. Like he really used that knowledge to his advantage in this situation.
He absolutely did.
So to set the scene a bit, we find Paul on trial before the Jewish council. He starts off his defense by saying, I've lived with a clear conscience before God. But things escalate really quickly. Like the high priest, Ananias, he actually orders Paul to be struck.
Yeah, and it really raises questions about, fairness and justice. Like, was this even a legal order? It just seems like, a blatant abuse of power.
Paul doesn't hold back either, right?
Yeah.
He calls Ananias a whited wall, which, I mean, that's pretty strong language, wouldn't you say? It almost seems like a risky move on Paul's part.
It definitely was bold, but I think it was calculated too. In that moment, Paul strategically shifts the focus, right? He asks this almost out-of-place question. Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? It's like, boom, he's dropping a truth bomb right there.
Yeah, like he's reminding everyone of his Roman citizenship.
Exactly. And remember that Roman citizenship came with some pretty significant legal protections.
Oh, totally. It's almost like he's pulling out a secret weapon or something. And then he adds another layer by saying, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I mean, what was he doing there? Was that just to cause more chaos?
Well, remember the council was already divided, right? Between the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Right.
And these groups held very different beliefs. So Paul expertly used that division to his advantage.
Their biggest point of contention was the resurrection, right? Like the Pharisees believed in it and the Sadducees did not.
Exactly. And remember, Paul was on trial in part because of his teachings about Jesus's resurrection.
So by aligning himself with the Pharisees on this specific point, he's basically
drawing the council into total chaos.
Yeah, it's a total power move. Like you can almost picture the courtroom, the council erupting in arguments, people shouting, and Paul is just standing there like watching the whole thing unfold. He totally turned the tables on his accusers.
It's pretty brilliant, actually.
As a result, he gets a temporary reprieve from judgment. But the drama doesn't stop there. Later that night, the Lord appears to Paul with this really encouraging message. He basically says, take courage, Paul. Just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine the comfort that must have brought to Paul in that moment?
It really highlights the fact that, even amidst all this chaos and threats, God was watching over Paul, like guiding his mission.
Right. And then just when you think things can't get any crazier, we have this plot twist. Right.
Oh, tell me about it. 40 Jews conspiring to kill Paul, and they even go as far as taking this solemn oath. Like they're saying, we won't eat or drink until we've killed Paul.
It's pretty intense. It really shows how much they opposed Paul, how much they saw him as a threat. Like they were absolutely determined to silence him.
No kidding. But thankfully, Paul has a nephew who gets wind of the plot.
Talk about a close call.
Seriously. And this nephew, he risks his own safety to warn Paul.
I mean, what a brave young man. He really was instrumental in saving Paul's life.
So the nephew alerts the Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, and he takes immediate action to protect Paul. What happens next is really a whirlwind.
It is. Lysias decides to send Paul, under heavy guard, to Caesarea. It was a brilliant strategic move.
Totally. Not only does it take Paul out of immediate danger, but it also shifts the legal battle to a completely new arena.
And that's where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Yeah, sending Paul to Caesarea, I mean, that was really the smartest move, right? Get him out of Jerusalem. Totally. It's like, okay, danger averted, at least for now. But his legal battle, definitely not over. It really is fascinating, though. Through all of this, Paul never loses sight of his mission, right? Spreading the message of Christianity. It makes you wonder what fueled that kind of resilience.
He really does. I mean, he understood the risks, the threats he faced. Still, he just remained committed.
Yeah. I mean, was it purely faith, a sense of duty, maybe a bit of both?
Yeah, I'd say it was probably a combination of things, like his deep conviction in his beliefs, for sure, but also, his responsibility to spread the gospel, plus his understanding of God's plan. It all probably played a part.
That makes sense. And we can't forget about that letter, right? The one that Claudius Lysias sends along with Paul to Governor Felix.
Right.
He's very careful with his words. Emphasizes that Paul is a Roman citizen and that he's been unjustly accused. almost like he's trying to, lay the groundwork for a favorable hearing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it shows how important it was to understand the whole legal and political system back then. And, Paul's Roman citizenship, the thing that he invoked earlier, remember? Well, now it becomes like this key factor in his defense.
So it all comes full circle. So, okay, Paul's in Caesarea now, waiting to meet Governor Felix. Do we know anything about this Felix guy? What kind of a ruler was he?
Well, history kind of paints this complex picture of him. I mean, some sources describe him as like really ruthless and corrupt, more interested in personal gain than
Oh,
justice.
wow. Okay, not exactly reassuring for Paul then.
Right. But then other sources suggest that, he had his moments of fairness, like he could be swayed by reason.
Hmm. So it sounds like Paul was walking into a situation with a very unpredictable, uh, possibly dangerous leader. Do we know how their meeting went?
Unfortunately, this passage in Acts doesn't really give us all those details, but we do know that Paul remained in custody under Felix.
So even though he got away from that immediate threat in Jerusalem, his journey's not over, not by a long shot.
Nope. Still facing an uncertain future, caught in the middle of Roman law and politics.
It's amazing, though, isn't it, how Paul's story is this mix of faith and like all these worldly systems. He wasn't just operating in some, purely spiritual realm.
Unfortunately not.
He had to deal with political figures, legal procedures, social dynamics. It was like this reminder that faith doesn't always just play out, in a vacuum. Often it's on this very messy and complicated stage.
Yeah, and Paul's story shows us how he stayed true to his beliefs while also dealing with like the reality of the world around him. I mean, it makes you think, right? How do we live out our own convictions in the face of difficult situations?
It's a great question. And speaking of thought-provoking, this whole episode is full of them, right? Every verse, every twist and turn. It feels like there's always something new to discover
Yeah.
about Paul, about the early Christian movement.
Even about ourselves.
Exactly. It really does make you want to dig deeper, look beyond just the surface.
It's what makes studying the Acts of the Apostles so rewarding. It's not just history, it's like this living text. It speaks to us across centuries.
Absolutely. So why don't we move to the final part of our deep dive? We'll unpack some key takeaways, see what kind of lessons we can learn from Paul's journey. So we've seen Paul, really using his smarts to navigate this situation, and the opposition he faces, it's intense. But then there's also this, this divine intervention that's just undeniable. What parts of this passage really stand out to you?
For me, it's how Paul's story is so tied to like the politics and the religion of the time. He wasn't just off in his own little world. I mean, he understood the whole Pharisee and Sadducee thing. He knew how to use his rights as a Roman citizen, and he used all that to survive, basically.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like even these great spiritual leaders, they had to deal with the same kind of mess that we do today.
Absolutely. It wasn't just preaching and teaching, it was understanding the system. And sometimes, working the system.
And that raises a question for us, right? How can we, like Paul, be faithful, but also, I don't know, savvy about how we live in the world?
It's a good question.
Yeah. It's easy to think, faith is over here and life is over there. But Paul shows us it's not that simple.
I think one of the biggest takeaways from all this is like, be more aware, be more discerning. Like what are the power dynamics in our own lives, but also in the world? And then how do we live out our values even when things are tough?
Well said.
Yeah.
It's definitely a lot to chew on. And it leaves us with plenty to think about as we keep following Paul on this wild journey.
It's been great unpacking this passage with you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.